Hey there! Welcome back to Unmuted Voices, where we are unlearning silence, reclaiming our voices, and speaking with more confidence and courage, one conversation at a time. I'm Aisha, founder and chief communications coach at Start in the Beginning, and longtime market research executive, and now author of Unmuted Voices How We Hear Accents and Learn to Judge Differently, a book I'm really excited to share more about soon. Today, we're talking about something that hits even closer to home than public speaking fear or accent bias. We're talking about the voice in our heads and how internalized bias shapes what we believe about ourselves before we even open our mouths. When we think about bias, we often imagine it coming from outside other people's judgments, assumptions, or stereotypes. But what happens when those messages sink in so deep that they start sounding like our own voice? Here's what we're covering today. First, we'll define internalized bias and what it sounds like in real life. Then, we'll explore where it comes from and why it's not your fault. Finally, I'll share some tools to help you unlearn those old scripts and begin rewriting your own voice from the inside out. Let's get into it. What does internalized bias sound like? Internalized bias isn't loud, it's not shouting. It's the quiet, constant voice that says things like, "Who do you think you are? You are not ready yet. You're too fill in the blank, too much, too little, too different." It sounds like doubt before you speak, editing yourself in real time, shrinking your ideas to fit someone else's mode. And here's the tricky part it sounds like your own voice, but it's not really yours. In layman's terms, internalized bias is when we absorb the negative messages society sends us about how we speak, how we look, or who we are, and we start believing them ourselves. It's what happens when the noise from the outside becomes the noise inside. So, where does it come from? Internalized bias doesn't appear overnight. It's absorbed slowly, quietly from the world around us, from media images about who belongs in leadership and who doesn't, from offhand comments about how we speak, dress, or show up, from systems that teach us whose voices get centered and whose gets headlined. Psychologists call this self stereotyping when marginalized groups start unconsciously believing the stereotypes about themselves and our brains, they prefer what's familiar. Concept called cognitive ease, meaning we're wired to trust what we've seen and heard the most, even if it's biased, even if it's wrong. Over time, if we're not careful, those outside messages become inside messages. They become the soundtrack we live by without even realizing it. This is something I dive deeper into in my new book, Unmuted Voices. Bias doesn't need a loud voice to do damage. It whispers until you start to think it's your own. The good news, once you realize that inner voice isn't really yours, you can start rewriting it. So, why does this matter? If the loudest voice in your head is telling you you're not enough, you start to believe it. You hesitate, you self sabotage, you shrink, and eventually you silence yourself before anyone else can. But you deserve better than that. Your ideas, your leadership, your voice deserve better than that. And it's not just new speakers or early career professionals who deal with this. Even leaders, experts, and people who feel completely confident on the outside, they carry these quiet voices too. Internalized bias doesn't ask for permission, it just moves in unless we call it out. I've worked with clients, incredibly talented leaders who've stayed quiet in meetings, not because they lacked knowledge, but because old voices in their heads say, "You don't sound right." And these aren't early career folks, they were seasoned professionals in their field. So internalized bias doesn't care how good you are, it only cares how small it can make you feel. But when you realize that voice really isn't yours, that's when everything starts to shift. So let's talk about three practical tools to reframe the voice. Here are a few ways you can start today. Number one, name the voice. When you catch that critical thought, pause. Ask yourself, whose voice is this really? Is it an old boss, a family member, society's expectations? Naming it creates distance, and distance gives you a choice. Number two, try neutral affirmations. If I'm amazing feels too forced, try this. I have a right to be here. My voice matters even if it shakes. Affirmations don't need to be wild or over the top, they just need to be more true than the bias you've been carrying. And lastly, number three, a reflection prompt from unmuted voices, right? A little sneak peek. Looking at your background, reflect on your beliefs, traditions, culture, and habits. Can you identify any conscious or unconscious biases you've internalized about your own voice and identity? You're going to write these down, you're going to name them, and that's where unlearning is going to start. So, a free tidbit for you. You don't have to believe every thought you think. You get to choose which ones you carry and which ones you lay down. If this conversation helped you spot a voice in your head that isn't really yours, that is a powerful first step. You are not the sum of other people's expectations. You're not the stories that you were taught about your voice. You are more and you're still becoming. If you want more tools, more conversations, and a sneak peek at unmuted voices before it's officially released, come find Unmuted Voices on Instagram and YouTube. We are building a community of people unlearning silence, one thought, one voice, one brave moment at a time. And hey, if this episode made you think of someone who's too hard on themselves, send it their way. You never know who needs the reminder that they are not broken, they are becoming. Next time, we'll be joined by a special guest, and together we'll dive into how bias shows up at work and how to recognize it, name it, and move through it with more clarity and power. Until then, your voice belongs here. Thanks for tuning in. Talk soon.